Out here, where the world bleeds into a flat line of dust and sky, you learn that silence has a sound. It ain't peaceful. It's the sound of waiting. And Elwood had been waiting for 15 years. His ranch house was a husk, a wooden skeleton baked brittle by the sun. The lantern on his table threw lazy, dancing shadows that looked like old ghosts trying to remember their shape. Crickets screamed in the fields, a sound so constant it was just part of the quiet. He sat in his chair by the open window, not for the breeze, but to hear trouble coming from a mile off. Trouble always came on the wind. Then he heard it. Not a coyote, not the rustle of a snake in the dust. 3 knocks, soft, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone testing the wood, seeing if it was real. Nobody comes to this ranch. Not anymore. Not unless they're bringing hell with them, or running from it. Elwood stood up, and the floorboards groaned under his boots, a sound like a tired old man sighing. He crossed the room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His heart gave a single hard kick against his ribs. He knew he shouldn't open it. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and regret, screamed at him to leave it shut, to let whatever was out there in the dark get swallowed by the night. But he opened it anyway, and what he saw didn't make a lick of sense. It was a boy, no older than 6, hair the color of dried straw, bare feet caked in dirt. There were tear tracks on his face, but his eyes were old. They were steady and hard, holding a kind of cold fearlessness that a kid has no business owning. The boy looked up at him, straight into his soul, and said 4 words that changed everything. "My daddy kicked us out." That's what he said. But the way he said it, it wasn't a plea. It was a statement, a fact. Like saying the sky is blue or the ground is dry. Elwood's gaze flickered past the boy, into the ink-black yard. And that's when he saw her, a crumpled shape near the barn. A woman. The lantern light barely kissed her form, but it was enough. He saw a torn dress, an arm thrown out at an angle that wasn't natural. Elwood didn't hesitate. He moved past the boy, his long legs eating up the distance to the barn in 4 quick strides. He knelt beside her. Her skin was hot, clammy. Her breath was a shallow little whisper. He could see a dark bruise blooming on her jaw, the ugly purple of it stark against her pale skin. He scooped her up. She was light as a bag of feathers, all bone and sorrow. She didn't stir, just let out a soft sigh, like she was sinking deeper into a bad dream she couldn't wake from. The boy followed him back to the house, a silent little shadow, his arms wrapped tight around his own chest. Inside, Elwood laid the woman on his worn leather sofa. He covered her with a thick wool blanket, then turned to the boy who stood frozen in the doorway, looking like a ghost who'd lost his haunting grounds. "Name?" Elwood's voice was rust. "Leo," the boy whispered. "She, your mama?" The boy just nodded. Elwood pointed to a chair by the hearth. "Sit." Leo sat. Elwood filled a tin cup with water and handed it to him. The boy drank it down like he'd been crossing a desert. For the first time in 15 years, there was the sound of someone else breathing under his roof, and it felt dangerous. He stoked the fire, checked the woman's pulse again. It was thready, weak. He sat in his chair watching them. The boy, Leo, eventually fell asleep at the table, his head on his arms. The woman on the sofa didn't move. Elwood stayed awake all night, a sentinel in his own home. He'd only get up to place a cool, wet cloth on the woman's forehead. He found himself whispering things into the dark, words he hadn't used since the fire. Words like, "It's all right, and I'll keep you safe." But as the first hint of dawn threatened the sky, he noticed something that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The woman's hand, resting on the blanket, was clean. Too clean. Her fingernails were perfectly filed, not a speck of dirt under them. A woman thrown from her home, collapsed in a dusty ranch yard, shouldn't have hands that looked like they'd just left a city parlor. The woman's name, he learned, was Ida. She woke up slow, her hazel eyes hazy with confusion and pain. She saw her son, Leo, asleep at the table, and a wave of something, relief, or maybe fear, washed over her face. "We'll be gone by sunup," she rasped, her voice rough. She tried to stand, but a wave of dizziness sent her crashing back onto the sofa. "Rest," Elwood said. his voice flat. He wasn't offering comfort. He was stating a fact. She clutched the blanket, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. I don't take charity. He just nodded. Wasn't offering it. Her story was simple, she said. A husband with a mean streak and a heavy hand. They'd run, and their car had broken down a few miles up the road. They'd walked until she couldn't walk anymore. It was a story that made sense. A story that happened all the time out here. But it didn't explain her hands, and it didn't explain the look in her boy's eyes. Later, Ida insisted on working. She cleaned his kitchen with a frantic energy, scrubbing counters that hadn't been truly clean in a decade. She swept the porch, her movements stiff with pain, but relentless. She was trying to earn her keep, or maybe she was trying to scrub away something else entirely. That night, Leo followed Elwood out to the barn to feed the chickens. The boy was quiet, but his eyes missed nothing. As Elwood scattered the feed, Leo picked up a strange, flat stone from the dirt. He turned it over in his small hands. Mama says some things look like one thing, but they're really something else, he said, his voice a little too old for his face. Elwood grunted. That's so? Leo nodded, his eyes fixed on the stone. Like this rock. It looks boring, but if you break it open, sometimes there's crystals inside. Pretty but sharp. He looked up at Elwood. She said Daddy was like that. A chill went down Elwood's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. The boy wasn't just talking about rocks. Later, when the moon was high and cold, Elwood stepped outside for a smoke. He watched the stars, the same cold, distant stars he'd watched for 15 lonely years. But tonight, they felt different. They felt like they were watching him back. When he went back inside, Ada had fallen asleep in the chair, a half-mended shirt of his in her lap. Her head was tilted to one side, and her hair had fallen across her face. And that's when he saw it. Tucked into the collar of her worn dress, almost completely hidden, was the faint glint of something gold. It wasn't a crucifix. It was a small, finely crafted pin. The pin was shaped like a serpent eating its own tail. He'd only seen that symbol once before, years ago. On the body of a man the law had paid him well to forget. A man who belonged to a very dangerous, very secret society. Suddenly, the story about a simple, abusive husband felt thin as smoke. The woman on his couch wasn't just running from a man. She was running from something far, far worse, and she had brought it right to his door. Elwood didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, the rifle now resting across his lap, and he watched Ada breathe. Every soft sigh, every twitch of her fingers was now a potential threat. The serpent pin, the Ouroboros. It was the mark of the Caden Kai, a syndicate so secretive, most people thought they were a ghost story. They weren't ghosts. They were bankers, politicians, killers, men who believed they were above the laws of God and man. And Elwood had once been hired to track one of them down. A job that had ended in blood and fire and had paid him enough to buy this ranch and disappear. He looked at Ada's face, so peaceful in sleep, and saw a liar. A good one. The story of a broken-down car and a mean husband was a perfect piece of camouflage. It was designed to prey on the pity of a lonely man. But what was she doing here? What did she want from him? Was this a coincidence? Or was his past finally catching up to him, wearing the face of a desperate mother? The next morning, the tension in the small house was thick enough to choke on. Eda moved around the kitchen, making coffee, her limp more pronounced. She was avoiding his eyes. She knew he'd seen the pin. Or maybe she was just a damn good actress. Leo sat on the porch steps, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Elwood went out and stood over him. The boy wasn't drawing stick figures or houses. He was drawing spirals. Interlocking spirals, over and over again. An intricate, hypnotic pattern. "What's that you're drawing, son?" Elwood asked, keeping his voice casual. Leo didn't look up. "A map," he said simply. "A map to where?" "The safe place," Leo whispered. Then he quickly scrubbed the drawing away with his bare foot, as if he'd said too much. Elwood's blood ran cold. This wasn't a game. The boy wasn't just playing. He was trained. Ida came to the doorway, wiping her hands on a rag. Her face was a mask of weary caution. "We should be on our way," she said. "My husband, he'll be looking for us." She was testing him, pushing the old story to see if it still held. Husband right, Elwood said, his voice flat. He looked straight at her. The one who gave you that bruise. Her eyes flickered, a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction. Yes. Elwood took a step closer. He lowered his voice so Leo couldn't hear. Funny thing about bruises like that, they tend to come from a right-handed man. But the story you told me, about him throwing you out of the car, the physics of that, you would have landed on your other side. The bruise should be on the other cheek. A flicker of panic in her eyes. Pure, undiluted fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off. And the pin you're wearing, the little snake, my grandmother had one just like it. It was a lie, a shot in the dark, but it hit its mark. Ada's face went pale as bone. She backed away a step, her hand instinctively going to her collar. I don't know what you're talking about. He didn't push. He just let the silence hang in the air, heavy and sharp. He had her, and she knew it. The game was over. Now the real danger would begin. Because if she was running from the Caden Kai, they wouldn't just send a husband. They would send hunters. And they would tear this ranch apart, board by board, to find what she had taken from them. The confession didn't come in a flood of tears. It came in terrified whispers later that night, after Leo was asleep. Ida, or whatever her real name was, told him a story that made his blood run cold. Her husband wasn't just a member of the Caden Kai. He was an inner circle bookkeeper. His name was Julian, and he wasn't abusive in the way she'd first described. He was cold, calculating, and possessive. He didn't see her as a wife. He saw her as an asset, a beautiful piece of property. He didn't beat me, she whispered, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding her own body together. He erased me. He told me what to wear, what to say, who to smile at. My entire life was a performance. The bruise, she admitted, wasn't from him. It was from one of his guards when she'd made her escape. And what had she taken? Not money, not jewels, something far more valuable. She reached into the lining of her worn dress and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. It was no bigger than her hand. His book, she breathed. It has everything in it. Names, accounts, transactions. Who they paid, who they silenced. It's the key to dismantling their entire North American operation. Elwood stared at the book. It felt heavier than lead. It was a death warrant. Why bring it here? He asked, his voice a low growl. Of all the places in this God-forsaken country, why my ranch? Her eyes were filled with a desperate, hunted light. Because of you, Elwood. Your name is in this book. The world tilted on its axis. His quiet life, his self-imposed exile, shattered in an instant. What? 15 years ago, the contract on Marcus Thorne, the Caden Kai member you were hired to eliminate. Her voice trembled. The book details the payment, an untraceable transfer to a holding company that was used to purchase this land. They know you're here. They've always known. But you were a ghost, a loose end they didn't bother to tie up. You were forgotten. She took a shaky breath. I figured they would never think to look for me with the one man they paid to kill one of their own. It's the one place they wouldn't expect. It was insane, it was brilliant, and it was a suicide mission. He was her cover, her human shield. His lonely, forgotten ranch was now ground zero. So you lied to me. You used me, he said, the words tasting like ash. I used the only thing I had left, she shot back, her fear momentarily replaced by a flash of steel. A ghost story, a legend, the best tracker and killer for hire the underworld had ever seen. I gambled that the man was still inside the hermit. He looked from her defiant face to the sleeping form of her son, the boy with the old eyes, the boy who drew maps to safe places. He wasn't just a child, he was a piece of the plan. She had been training him, preparing him. The knock on the door, the story, the collapse in the yard, it was all a script, a perfectly rehearsed play designed to get them inside his walls. And it had worked. Suddenly a floorboard creaked upstairs. It was Leo. He stood at the top of the stairs, his small frame silhouetted against the moonlight. He wasn't crying. He wasn't scared. He held something in his hand, a small carved wooden bird. They're coming, Mama, he said, his voice as clear and calm as a winter morning. "I heard the car on the old ridge road." Elwood moved without thinking. He grabbed the rifle, snuffing out the lantern with his other hand, plunging the room into near total darkness. "Get in the cellar," he hissed at Ida. "Now!" She didn't argue. She grabbed Leo's hand and pulled him toward the hidden door beneath the rug. Elwood moved to the window, peering through the warped glass. The boy was right. Two faint headlights were cutting through the blackness, moving slowly, deliberately, down the long dirt road that led to his ranch. They weren't rushing. They were confident. They were hunters closing in on their prey. Ada paused at the cellar door, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "Elwood, go," he commanded. She squeezed Leo's hand and disappeared into the dark below, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The click of the latch echoed in the silent house. Elwood was alone again, but the silence was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the chilling certainty of violence. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the cold metal a familiar and unwelcome weight. He wasn't a hermit anymore. He wasn't a lonely rancher. He was the man they had paid 15 years ago, and they had come to collect. Not just the ledger, they had come to collect him too. He peered through the scope, lining up the approaching headlights. But then he saw something else, something that made his stomach drop. It wasn't a car, it was two cars, and flanking them on either side, moving silently through the tall grass, were four men on horseback. It wasn't a collection party, it was a small army. The two cars pulled up just beyond the fence line, their headlights cutting bright, sterile cones into the darkness, pinning the small ranch house in a merciless glare. The engines died, and the sudden silence was deafening. The men on horseback fanned out, creating a perimeter. There was no escape. Elwood didn't panic. The part of him that had been dormant for 15 years, the cold, calculating part, was now wide awake. He wasn't Elwood the rancher anymore. He was the man from the ledger. He counted them. 2 in each car plus the 4 riders. 8 men. Too many for a direct confrontation. The front door of the house was suicide. The windows were death traps. They knew the layout. Of course they did. They'd known where he was for years. The front door of the lead car opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a tailored suit that looked ridiculously out of place in the dusty yard. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a lawyer or a banker. He smoothed his tie, took a deep breath of the country air as if he were sampling fine wine, and then he spoke. His voice carried, calm and clear, across the yard. "Elwood Harper, my name is Mr. Sterling. I believe you have something that belongs to my employer, a small book, and his wife and son. We would very much like them back." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Cooperate, and we can forget this unfortunate intrusion ever happened. We might even forget about your own past indiscretions." It was a practiced, reasonable tone, the kind of voice that promised a clean, painless solution while holding a knife behind its back. Elwood remained silent, a shadow within the shadows of his own home. He knew their games. They'd offer a deal, get him to lower his guard, and then put a bullet in his head. Mr. Sterling sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. "I was hoping you'd be sensible. Julian is quite sentimental about his property, especially the boy. He has such potential." The words were a threat, clear and sharp. They weren't just after the ledger. They wanted Leo. Why? What was so special about the boy? Sterling gestured to one of the riders. The man dismounted, uncoiled a rope from his saddle, and with a practiced flick of his wrist, lassoed the porch railing. He pulled, and the old wood groaned in protest. "We can do this the easy way, Elwood, or we can take your house apart, piece by piece, until we find what we're looking for. And when we find you, well, Julian has instructed us to be thorough." The rider pulled again, and a section of the railing splintered, cracking with a sound like breaking bone. Elwood knew he had to do something. Create a diversion. Change the battlefield. His eyes scanned the darkened room and landed on the hearth, the old cast-iron stove. An idea sparked, dangerous and desperate. He crept away from the window, moving with a silence born of long practice. He grabbed the can of kerosene he used for the lamps. He worked quickly, sloshing the flammable liquid over the floorboards, the curtains, the old wooden table. The smell filled the small room, sharp and acrid. The smell of destruction, the smell of his past. The riders were now pulling at the porch supports. The entire front of the house was groaning, threatening to collapse. Sterling watched, impassive, his hands clasped behind his back. Elwood backed toward the rear of the house, toward the small kitchen window that led out toward the barn. He held a single match in his hand. He was about to set his own home on fire, the home he had built as a cage to keep the world out. But as he prepared to strike the match, he heard a sound from the cellar, a soft, rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of fear, it was a code. The sound from the cellar was a signal he didn't understand. But Ida would. He hesitated, matchbook in hand. Setting the house on fire was his plan, his only chance to create chaos and escape out the back. But that thumping, it was deliberate. It changed the equation. Outside, a loud crack echoed as the main porch beam gave way. The roof over the porch sagged, groaning under the strain. Last chance, Elwood. Sterling's voice was tighter now, the politeness fraying at the edges. Elwood made a decision. He trusted the thumping. He trusted the woman he'd only known for a day, the woman who had lied to him and put a target on his back. He crept to the cellar door, lifted it a fraction of an inch, and whispered into the darkness. What is it? Ida's voice came back, strained and urgent. Leo, he says the barn, the well in the barn. The well, the old dry well in the center of the barn. He hadn't used it in years. It was just a dark hole covered with heavy wooden planks. What about it? He says it's a way out, Ada whispered. There's a tunnel. He saw it on the maps. The maps, the spirals the boy had been drawing in the dirt. They weren't just random doodles. They were schematics. How could he possibly know that? The boy had never been in the barn, but there was no time to question it. The front door of the house splintered as one of the riders used a sledgehammer on the lock. Time was up. Go now, Elwood hissed. Stay low. I'll meet you there. He closed the cellar door, leaving the match unlit. The fire was a bad plan anyway. It was what they'd expect from a cornered animal. He needed to be a ghost. He slipped out the small kitchen window at the back of the house just as the front door burst open. He hit the ground in a silent roll, coming up in a crouch behind a row of overgrown rose bushes. He could hear them shouting inside, overturning furniture, their heavy boots thumping on the floorboards. He had seconds. He moved, bent low, a dark shape flowing through the deeper shadows, his path taking him wide around the house toward the dark, looming silhouette of the barn. The moon was a sliver, but the starlight was bright enough to make the open ground between him and the barn a killing field. The horsemen were positioned as sentinels, their heads turning, scanning the darkness. He couldn't make a straight run for it. He'd have to use the terrain, a ditch, a woodpile, a rusted-out tractor. He moved from cover to cover, his breath held tight in his chest, the rifle a cold, awkward weight in his hands. He was halfway there when a shout went up from the house. He's not here! Check the barn! The headlights of the cars swiveled, their beams slicing through the night, sweeping across the yard. One of the beams caught him for a split second, a deer in the glare. A shot rang out, then another. Bullets whizzed past his head, thudding into the side of the tractor. He dove, rolling behind it, the metal groaning as another round slammed into it. He was pinned down. The riders spurred their horses, converging on his position. He was out of time and out of options. He raised his rifle, sighted on the lead rider, and was about to pull the trigger when something impossible happened. The lights on the ranch house, which should have been dark, suddenly flickered on. All of them. The porch light, the kitchen light, the upstairs bedroom light. They blinked on and off in a steady rhythmic pattern. It was Morse code, and it was a distress signal. But it wasn't just SOS. It was a specific code, a military code, one that Elwood recognized from a life he thought was long buried. It was the call sign of his old unit, and there was only one other person in the world who knew it. The blinking lights from the house were a message from a ghost. Elwood lay behind the tractor, his mind reeling. It wasn't Ida. It couldn't be. That code belonged to his past, a past he'd never spoken of to anyone. It was the call sign for the Phantom Unit, a black ops team that officially didn't exist. The lights were a beacon, a signal flare fired in the dark. But for who? The riders, confused by the sudden display, reined in their horses. Sterling stepped out from the house, his face a mask of cold fury. "What is this? Find him!" he roared. The momentary confusion was the only opening Elwood would get. He didn't run for the barn. He ran back toward the house. It was insane running toward the enemy, but his gut screamed that the answer to the impossible riddle of the lights was inside. He moved in a low crouch, using the chaos as cover. He circled around to the side of the house, where a single window looked into his small, unused study. He peered inside, and what he saw made no sense. The room was empty. The light was coming from a simple lamp on the desk, but there was no one there to be flicking the switch. Then he saw it, a complex little device, a mess of wires and a small clockwork timer connected to the lamp's cord. It was a preset signaling device. Someone had planted it in his house. But who and when? A new voice, sharp and female, cut through the night from a stand of cottonwood trees about 100 yards away. "Sterling, stand down! Federal agents!" The effect was electric. Sterling's men froze. The riders looked nervously at each other. Sterling himself spun around, his composure finally cracking. "Who's there? Identify yourselves!" Two figures emerged from the trees, clad in black tactical gear, rifles held at the ready. But they weren't federal agents. Elwood knew the way they moved, the way they held their weapons. They were professionals. Mercenaries. Just like he used to be. This wasn't a rescue. This was an interception. A third party had entered the game. Sterling, realizing he'd been tricked, barked an order. "It's a bluff! Take them all!" The yard erupted into a storm of gunfire. The two newcomers returned fire with disciplined, precise bursts, forcing Sterling's men to take cover. It was the break Elwood needed. He smashed the study window with the butt of his rifle, clambered inside, and ran through the house. The signaling device on the desk was still blinking its phantom message. He ignored it and made for the cellar. He threw open the door. Ida and Leo were huddled at the bottom of the stairs, their faces pale with terror. "The barn now!" he yelled over the sound of gunfire. He herded them out the back door, and they sprinted across the open ground toward the barn. Bullets tore through the air around them. He could hear Sterling shouting orders, trying to regain control of the chaos. They burst through the barn doors, the familiar smell of hay and dust filling their lungs. "The well!" Ida cried, pointing to the center of the barn. Elwood and Ida tugged at the heavy wooden planks covering the old well. They were heavy, swollen with age. Leo, surprisingly strong, helped them. As they slid the final plank away, revealing a dark, gaping hole, Elwood glanced back at the house. The two mysterious mercenaries were holding their own, but they were outnumbered. Sterling's men were advancing, flanking them. He saw Sterling himself, standing by one of the cars, speaking urgently into a satellite phone. He wasn't retreating. He was calling for reinforcements. This night was far from over. "Go!" Elwood urged Ida. She hesitated, looking at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off. Find the tunnel. Go!" He gave her a shove toward the well. She helped Leo down a short, rickety ladder into the darkness. Just before she disappeared herself, she looked back at him. "Elwood, the ledger isn't the only thing I took." He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "It's Leo," she said, her voice cracking. "He's not my son." The words hit Elwood like a physical blow. He's not my son. The chaos outside, the gunfire, the approaching hunters. It all faded into a dull roar. He stared down into the darkness of the well, where Ada had just disappeared. Leo, the boy with the old eyes, the boy who drew maps of places he'd never seen. If he wasn't her son, then who or what was he? A new wave of gunfire from the yard snapped him back to reality. He didn't have time to process this. He had to trust her. He had to get them out. He turned from the well and took up a position behind a stack of hay bales near the barn door, peering through a small gap. The battle in the yard had shifted. The two mystery mercs were good, brutally efficient, but Sterling's numbers were winning. One of the mercs was down, clutching a leg. The other was pinned behind an old water trough. Sterling was advancing, a pistol in his hand, a cruel smile on his face. He was enjoying this. Elwood raised his rifle. He had a clear shot at Sterling. He could end this, right here, right now. Put a bullet in the man in the fancy suit, and maybe, just maybe, buy enough time for Ida and the boy to escape. His finger tightened on the trigger. But then Leo's words echoed in his head. Mama says, sometimes bad men don't look like bad men. Was Sterling the real threat? Or was he just a well-dressed dog on a much longer leash? Killing him might feel good, but it wouldn't stop the Caden. They'd just send someone else, someone worse. No, he needed answers, and he needed leverage. His gaze shifted from Sterling to the car he'd been standing beside, an expensive black sedan. The windows were tinted, but he could just make out the shape of a driver in the front seat, and something else in the back. A briefcase. A plan, born of pure desperation, formed in his mind. He wasn't a soldier anymore, ordered to take out a target. He was a survivor, and he had to think like one. He fired, not at Sterling. He fired at the car's front tire. The shot was perfect. The tire exploded with a loud bang. He fired again, taking out the other front tire. The sedan sank on its axles, immobilized. Sterling spun around enraged, firing blindly toward the barn. The remaining mercenary used the distraction to her advantage. It was the woman. She laid down a volley of covering fire, dragging her wounded partner back toward the cover of the cottonwood trees. Sterling's men were now divided, some firing at the barn, others at the retreating mercs. The chaos was perfect. Elwood didn't wait. He slipped out a side door of the barn, a shadow moving along the fence line. He was circling, coming up behind the cars. He was exposed, every step a gamble, but they were all focused on the barn and the trees. He reached the crippled sedan, his heart pounding against his ribs. The driver was shouting into a radio, his back to the window. Elwood smashed the glass with the butt of his rifle, unlocked the door, and dragged the man out. It was over in seconds. He was inside the car. The briefcase was on the back seat. He grabbed it. It was heavy, locked with a biometric scanner. He didn't have time for that. He looked in the glove compartment. He found what he was looking for. A satellite phone. He dialed the number Sterling had just been calling. He knew it was a long shot. He didn't even know who would answer. The phone rang once. A voice answered, cold, clipped, and laced with authority. Report. It was a voice that expected obedience. Elwood took a breath. This isn't Sterling, he said, his voice low and steady. You and I need to have a conversation about your property. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not of shock, but of cold, calculating assessment. Then the voice replied, a hint of something that might have been amusement in its tone. Mr. Harper, I was wondering when you'd rejoin the world. Tell me, what is your price? Elwood looked through the windshield at the firefight still raging in his yard. He thought of Ida and the boy who wasn't her son, escaping through a dark tunnel. He thought about the 15 years of silence he had just lost forever. My price, Elwood said, is everything you have. The voice on the other end of the phone, the voice of the man who pulled Sterling's strings, chuckled. It was a dry, reptilian sound. Bold, Mr. Harper, but you're in no position to bargain. You have a stolen briefcase, and you're surrounded. I have a dozen more men 10 minutes away. This ends one way. It ends the way I say it ends, Elwood countered, his voice like ice. He was bluffing, playing a hand with no cards, but it was the only play he had. I've got your bookkeeper's ledger. I've got his son, and now I have this briefcase. I'm going to open it, and whatever is inside, I'm going to scatter it to the four winds, unless you call off your dogs, right now. He could hear the man thinking, the gears turning. You can't open that case, Harper, not without my fingerprint. You'd be surprised what a man can open with enough kerosene and a lit match, Elwood lied. He was buying seconds, that's all. Seconds for Ida and Leo to get clear. The gunfire outside was starting to taper off. The two mercs had vanished back into the darkness of the trees. Sterling was regrouping his men, their attention turning back to the barn and the house. Time was up. Here's the deal, Elwood said, speaking fast. You get your men to stand down, they pull back to the main road and they wait. I walk out of here with the woman and the boy. You get your precious briefcase back, unopened. The ledger, that's my insurance policy. You ever come near me, or them, again, and the whole world gets to read it. Another long pause. The man was weighing his options. The contents of the briefcase versus the ledger. The life of a bookkeeper's wife versus something else. Something connected to the boy. And the boy? The voice asked, a sudden sharpness in its tone. The boy goes with me, Elwood said, a protective instinct he didn't know he had flaring to life. He's part of the deal. Unacceptable, the voice snapped. And in that single word, Elwood understood everything. The ledger was a trifle. Ada was a nuisance. The briefcase was important. But the boy was everything. He didn't have time to wonder why. He heard boots crunching in the dirt outside the car. Sterling and two of his men were approaching. Elwood ended the call. He was out of options. He looked at the briefcase on the seat beside him. It was his only card left to play. He couldn't open it, but maybe he didn't have to. The biometric scanner was a small glass plate, glowing with a faint red light. An idea, insane and suicidal, bloomed in his mind. He took off his belt. He looped it through the handle of the briefcase, cinching it tight. He opened the car door and stood up, holding the briefcase in front of him like a shield. Sterling stopped, his eyes widening as he saw the case. Harper, don't be a fool. You have no idea what you're holding. I know it's the only thing keeping me alive, Elwood snarled. He started walking. Not toward the barn, not toward the road. He walked straight toward Sterling. Tell your men to lower their weapons. Sterling hesitated, his gaze locked on the briefcase. Do it! Elwood roared, taking another step. Sterling reluctantly waved his men down. Their rifles lowered, but their eyes were still trained on him. Give me the case, Harper, Sterling said, his voice a low, placating murmur. The way you'd talk to a wild animal. Let's all walk away from this. You first, Elwood said, his eyes scanning the yard. Where were the mercs? Had they just abandoned the fight? As if in answer, a spotlight suddenly flared to life from the roof of the barn. It wasn't Elwood's. It was military grade, and it pinned Sterling and his men in its brilliant, unwavering beam. The female mercenary's voice boomed out through a megaphone. Caden Kai operatives, drop your weapons. You are surrounded by a superior force. This is your only warning. Sterling's men looked around in panic. It was a bluff, of course. It was just the two of them. But in the dark and confusion, it was working. Sterling, however, wasn't fooled. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. A superior force of two? I think not. He raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at Elwood's chest. The case, Harper. Now. But he never got to finish his sentence. A single, silent shot rang out from the darkness near the cottonwood trees. A small, red dot appeared on Sterling's forehead. He stood there for a second, a look of profound surprise on his face, and then he crumpled to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. The remaining Caden Kai men froze in shock. The female merc's voice echoed again from the barn roof. The next one goes through the knee. Your choice. One by one, they dropped their guns. It was over. The woman slid down a rope from the barn roof, landing with cat-like grace. Her wounded partner limped out from the trees, leaning on her for support. She was all business. You must be Elwood Harper, she said, not offering a hand. My name is Cale. We need to go. Now. Their backup will be here in less than 5 minutes. Who are you? Elwood demanded, still holding the briefcase. We're the ones who put that signaling device in your house last week, she said, as if that explained everything. We've been watching you, waiting for Ada to make her move. You work for the government? Cal let out a short, humorless laugh. Nothing so noble. Let's just say we're competitors of the Caden Kai, and they have something we want very badly. She nodded toward the barn. The boy. Elwood's blood ran cold. He had just walked from one fire into another. These people weren't here to rescue them. They were here to abduct Leo. Where are they? He growled. Cale's eyes were hard as flint. The tunnel is a dead end, Harper. It collapsed years ago. We sealed the well entrance a few minutes ago. They're trapped in the barn. She raised her rifle, pointing it not at Elwood, but at the barn door. Now give us the boy, and we'll let you and the woman walk away. Like hell I will, Elwood snarled, swinging the briefcase around to shield himself. He was standing between two factions who both wanted the same thing, and he was beginning to realize that Leo was not a boy, but a prize. What's so important about him? Cal's expression didn't change, but her partner, leaning against her, grimaced in pain and spoke for the first time. His voice was strained. He's not a what, he's a who. His name isn't Leo, it's Leonidas. He's the only son of Dominic Caden, the head of the entire organization. The revelation was a gut punch. Ada hadn't just stolen a ledger from a bookkeeper. She had stolen the heir to the entire Caden Kai empire from her husband, the Don's son. But that wasn't the biggest shock. And Ada, Elwood asked, his voice barely a whisper. Her real name is Isabella, the wounded man said. Isabella Thorne. Thorne, the name from the ledger. The name of the man Elwood had been paid to kill 15 years ago. She's Marcus Thorne's sister, the man finished. She didn't marry into the Caden Kai. She infiltrated them. She's been playing a long game, all to get close enough to burn them to the ground for what they did to her brother. It all clicked into place. Ada, Isabella, hadn't stumbled upon his ranch by chance. She had come for him specifically, not just for cover, but for retribution. She was seeking out her brother's killer. Her plan was to use him, and then, undoubtedly, to kill him herself. This was never about escape. It was about revenge, and he was the final piece of her puzzle. Before he could even react to this ultimate betrayal, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Not one or two, a convoy. The Caden Kai reinforcements. Cale cursed under her breath. Time's up, Harper. The boy. Now! He was trapped. Caden Kai in front. These mysterious competitors behind. And inside the barn was a woman who wanted him dead, and a boy who was the key to everything. He made a choice. He threw the briefcase. Not at Cale. He hurled it with all his strength toward the abandoned Caden Kai cars. It landed on the hood of one with a loud clang. You want it? Go get it! He yelled. It was the diversion he needed. Kyle and her partner instinctively turned toward the sound. Elwood spun around and sprinted for the barn. He burst through the doors, slamming and bolting them behind him just as the first of the new Caden Kai vehicles skidded to a halt in the yard. The barn was dark and eerily quiet. Isabella! He yelled, his voice echoing in the rafters. She emerged from the shadows of an empty horse stall. Leonidas, was behind her, his small hand clutching hers. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. There was no longer any trace of the frightened, helpless woman from the night before. This was a woman of pure, cold fury. In her other hand she held a small, silver pistol, and it was aimed directly at his heart. You know, she said, her voice dangerously calm. I do, he answered, his own rifle still in his hands but pointed at the floor. My brother was a good man, she said, her voice trembling with 15 years of suppressed grief. He wasn't a gangster. He was an investigative journalist. He got too close, so Dominic Caden put a price on his head, a price you were happy to collect. The pain of the past was a raw, open wound between them. I was a different man then, Elwood said quietly. It was a job. I didn't know who he was. It doesn't matter, she cried, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. You took him from me. I spent 15 years of my life inside that snake pit. I married Julian, the monster's son. I had a child with him, all to find a way to make them pay. And to find you. The pieces were all there now. She had faked the escape, knowing it would draw out Julian's forces. She had led them here, to his doorstep, using her own son as bait. And these other mercenaries, Cale and her partner, Isabella must have hired them. They were her cavalry, meant to intercept Julian's men and help her finish the job. But something had gone wrong. They hadn't come to rescue her. They had come to take the boy for themselves. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. Now everyone was here. Everyone wanted the boy. And she was standing here, ready to kill the only man who could possibly help her. Outside, the yard was a war zone. The newly arrived Caden Kai forces were engaged in a fierce firefight with Kale's small team. It was a battle they couldn't possibly win. "They'll kill us all," Elwood said, his voice urgent. "They'll take the boy. Is that what you want? Is your revenge worth your son's life?" Isabella's gun wavered. The conflict tore at her. Vengeance versus motherhood. "There's no way out," she whispered, her resolve crumbling. "Yes, there is," Elwood said, taking a slow step forward. "The tunnel. You said Leo saw it on the maps." "He did," she sobbed. "But it's not real. It's just a story my husband told him. A fairy tale about a secret escape route his grandfather built." It was then that the boy Leonidas stepped out from behind his mother. His face was calm, his old eyes clear and focused. He looked not at his mother, not at Elwood, but at the floor of the barn. "It is real," he said, his voice steady. He walked to the center of the barn, to the spot where the old well should have been. But he didn't point at the well. He pointed at the floor beside it, at a single unassuming flagstone that looked just like all the others. "The map wasn't of the well," he said. "It was of the stars. The stars have to be right." He knelt down and pressed the stone. For a moment nothing happened. Then with a low grinding sound of stone on the stone, a section of the barn floor slid away, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. The fairy tale was real, and the boy, the heir to the Caden Kai, had just shown them the way out. The sound of the grinding stone was masked by the escalating firefight outside. Isabella stared at the uncovered staircase, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Her son, the child she had borne as a tool of her revenge, had just saved them. He looked up at her. "Grandfather Caden showed me. It's how he moves his real treasures." The boy was not a prize. He was a key. Elwood didn't waste a second. "Go!" he yelled, pushing them toward the opening. "I'll hold them off." Isabella hesitated, her pistol still in her hand. She looked at Elwood, at the man who killed her brother, the man she had planned to execute herself. But in his eyes she didn't see a killer. She saw a protector, a man trying to atone for his past. She made her choice. She holstered her pistol. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We do this together." Outside, a massive explosion rocked the yard. Kyle, realizing she was outmatched, had blown up one of the Caden Kai vehicles, creating a wall of fire and chaos. It was a desperate final act. It wouldn't hold them for long. Elwood nodded. He, Isabella, and Leonidas descended the stone steps, pulling the heavy flagstone door shut above them. They were plunged into absolute darkness. Elwood fumbled for the small lighter in his pocket. He flicked it on, the tiny flame pushing back the suffocating black. They were in a narrow, hand-dug tunnel. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and time. "Which way?" Elwood asked. Leonidas, calm as ever, pointed down the left fork without hesitation. "This way leads to the old creek bed, half a mile east." They moved quickly, the lighter flame their only guide. They could hear the faint sounds of the battle above them, fading as they went deeper. The tunnel was old, reinforced with heavy wooden beams. It was a smuggler's tunnel, a bootlegger's escape route from a forgotten era, and Dominic Caden had repurposed it. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. The tunnel opened up into a small cave, hidden behind a curtain of overgrown vines at the edge of a dry creek bed. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. They were out. They were free, but they weren't safe. Isabella looked at Elwood, the morning light softening the hard lines on his face. "Thank you," she whispered. It was an admission, an absolution, a truce. The 15 years of hatred she had nurtured was gone, burned away in the fire of the last few hours. "We're not done yet," Elwood said, his gaze scanning the horizon. "They'll tear that ranch apart. When they don't find us, they'll start searching the whole county. We need to disappear." He looked at the boy, Leonidas, the child who had been born into a world of lies and violence, now standing in the dawn of a new day. "And what about him?" Elwood asked. "He's the heir to their whole rotten empire. They will never stop looking for him." Isabella knelt down and put her hands on her son's shoulders. "He's not their heir anymore," she said, her voice filled with a fierce, protective love. "He's just my son, and his name is Leo." She looked at Elwood, a question in her eyes. "There's a place," he said after a long moment, "a cabin deep in the mountains, a place no one knows about. We can go there. We can be ghosts." It was a new beginning, forged in violence and betrayal, but a beginning nonetheless. Three broken people, a woman of vengeance, a boy of secrets, and a man of regret, standing on the edge of a new life. As they prepared to move, Elwood paused. He looked back in the direction of his ranch, his home for 15 years. It was just a place, a collection of wood and nails. But it had been his sanctuary, his prison. And now it was a battlefield. He knew he could never go back. But as he turned to leave, he felt a strange sense of peace. The silence he had lived in for so long had been the silence of a man hiding from his past. But now he was running toward a future. And he wasn't running alone. They traveled for 2 days, moving only at night, sticking to the shadows. Elwood led them through forgotten trails and dense forests, his old tracking skills serving them in a way he never imagined they would again. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a guide, a protector. Isabella, the woman who had spent half her life honing her hatred, was now focused solely on her son. She taught him the names of constellations, told him stories that had nothing to do with lies or secrets, and for the first time, he began to act like a child. He laughed. The sound of it echoed in the quiet woods, a sound of pure, untainted joy. On the third morning they arrived. The cabin was small, tucked away in a valley so remote it didn't appear on any map. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney. Elwood tensed, his hand going to his rifle. He had told no one about this place. As they approached cautiously, the cabin door opened. An old woman stood there, her face a road map of wrinkles, a shotgun resting comfortably in the crook of her arm. "Took you long enough, boy," she said, her voice raspy but warm. She wasn't looking at Elwood. She was looking at Leo. Isabella stepped forward, confused. "Who are you?" The old woman smiled, a knowing, ancient smile. "My name is Serafina, and I've been waiting for my grandson." She looked at Isabella. "Your husband, Julian, he wasn't Dominic Caden's son. I am Dominic's only child. He disowned me for marrying a simple farmer. Julian was my son. I sent him into his grandfather's world to burn it down from the inside, just like you." The final twist landed, rearranging the entire story one last time. Julian, Isabella's cold and calculating husband, hadn't been a villain. He had been a double agent, working with his estranged mother to destroy his own family's empire. His coldness, his possessiveness, it was all an act to protect her, to keep her in a gilded cage where she would be safe until the time was right. The ledger, the escape, leading the Caden Kai to Elwood's ranch, it had all been part of Julian's plan, a plan he never got to finish. "He was killed," Serafina said, her voice heavy with a grief she had carried in secret. 2 weeks ago, his grandfather discovered what he was doing. Julian knew they were coming for him. His last act was to send you on this path, to send you to the one man he knew could get you here. She looked at Elwood. "He knew you were a man of honor, Elwood Harper. He knew you took the contract on Marcus Thorne because you thought he was a criminal. Julian's ledger was meant to clear your name as much as it was to expose his family. And Kyle, the mercenary? She worked for Julian," Serafina explained. "She was his failsafe. Her job was to get Leo, the real prize, at all costs and bring him here. So much violence, so much fear, all orchestrated by ghosts. A grand tragic play where everyone was a pawn, moved by hands they couldn't see." Elwood looked at Isabella. Her face was pale, her mind struggling to accept this new reality. The man she hated, the man she had married as part of her revenge, had loved her. He had been on her side all along, and he had died for it. There, in that remote valley, a new kind of family was born, a family of survivors. Serafina, the exiled matriarch. Isabella, the widow who had found justice in the most unexpected way. Leo, the boy who was no longer an heir to a criminal empire, but the keeper of a complicated legacy. And Elwood, the killer who had become a guardian, the hermit who had found a home. The quiet of the mountains was different from the quiet of the plains. It wasn't the sound of waiting or hiding. It was the sound of peace, a peace they had all earned. And as the sun set behind the peaks, casting long, gentle shadows across their new beginning, Elwood knew that the 3 knocks on his door hadn't been the sound of trouble arriving. They had been the sound of destiny, finally coming home to collect. If this story made you believe in second chances, even when they're born from chaos and secrets, then do us a favor. Hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us that even in the darkest of nights, a new dawn is waiting. And let us know in the comments below, what's the biggest secret you've ever had to keep? We read every single one. Thanks for watching.